Hello, hello, hello. Happy Tuesday. I'm back. Hello. Good to see everyone. I know I took a day off yesterday. So now we need to get caught up. We're going to be covering Mackenzie Shirla transcripts. I left off on part 2 quite like maybe a week ago, I think. Yeah, we've been consumed with Lindsay Clancy. And we do have a Lindsay Clancy live for later. So shout out to everyone who's here and replaying and supporting. I appreciate you all. Last time I read these, I think day one, part one. Um, does that make sense? Yeah. I read it with Kalina, but no Kalina today, so I'll be reading them myself, which is fine. We do readings all the time. I should have asked her to come, but I didn't even think about it. Hey Meow, hey Anthony, Creatively, Peach, Cree, Pamela. I know we got a lot to catch up on. Lindsay Clancy, Crystal. I see you. Debbie, Jerry, and Bam. Hey Velvet. Yeah, we are going to be doing. I'm behind one day, so after this, we'll get caught up on day 19, and then we'll see where we're at. I know day 20 today was long, and people are losing their damn mind about Lindsay Clancy trial. Also, I've been getting a lot of comments about when I'm going to read the rest of Hayden's book. I will probably resume on them tomorrow. I reached out to the publisher just for like YouTube purposes, so I'm waiting to hear back on them, but I will probably resume tomorrow. And try to get the book done as fast as I can. So let's continue. We left off, if these are the Mackenzie Shirla adult trial transcripts, I believe we left off when the prosecution was playing a video. Basically, it's Detective Stanislaw Galassi. I'm trying to think of the other one. I have to go all the way back. An Officer Robinson. I think today we'll get to Detective Vanek on the stand. Yeah, we might get to him today. So these are the officers, obviously, that arrived at the scene first and worked the scene first. So we left off on the last step with Kalina where they were playing a video in court. So Tim Troop and Kupak or Kupach, I don't know, whatever her name is, respectfully. They're obviously the prosecution. And McDonald is on Kenzie's. I haven't done a Kenzie live in a while. Hayden's book, whoops, just answered me. Yes. I'll resume on that probably tomorrow. I'm going to try to finish Kenzie and Hayden before I start a new case that we're going to deep dive. So we'll definitely finish those probably this week. Okay. Enough yapping because people are going to be like, oh my God. And as we read these, I know it's been a little bit all over the place with the Kenzie case, but my opinion is still my opinion. I still think she deserves a fair trial, a new trial. R.I.P. Dom and Davion, that'll never change. And I've been thinking of reviewing the text messages again. So we'll probably be doing that. I just want to look at them with new eyes and a new perspective. So we might be doing that again. If you were here for the last reading, you know how fun that was. Okay, so the court says, this is a good time to take a break. Let's take a break, sir. You are under oath. Okay. So there's a discussion. Can we see the attorneys at the sidebar? There's a discussion was had between court and counsel at sidebar off the record. Then a recess was taken. Thereupon, the following proceedings were open in court. Okay, so the court says, despite the admonition, the deputy saw at least 3 people with their phones out. If I see anybody with their phones out again, you will not be permitted in the room. Your phones are to be turned off and put away. Oh, so during the trial, someone had their phone off. A phone out. Wonder who that was. Ms. Kupak says, for the record, I am starting the video at 15 minutes and 36 minutes and completing it at 26 minutes and 35 seconds. I wonder if she meant seconds. The court says, for the record, you're not starting it, you're restarting it. Ms. Kupak says, I'm restarting the video at 15 minutes and 36 seconds. So then a video was played, and she asks, stopping the video at 26 minutes and 41 seconds, that will conclude the portion we are playing. Officer Galassi, is that a fair and accurate depiction of the scene as you recall it to be that day? Officer Galassi responds, yes. Officer Galassi, you had testified earlier as to the location of both Davion Flanagan and Dominic Russo's body inside the vehicle. Do you recall that? He says, yes. Do you recall watching your body camera video where it showed a shot of the two individuals inside the vehicle? He says, yes. If I showed you a still shot of their positions inside the car, would you be able to recognize it? He says, yes. Ms. Kupak says, for the record, this is going to be State's Exhibit 3. The court says, sir, you need to take a seat, please. Ms. Kupak says, may I approach? Thank you. Officer Galassi, I'm handing you State's Exhibit 3. One moment, Your Honor. Officer Galassi, I don't have it up on the screen here. What I just handed you, what is State Exhibit 3? He says it's a picture of the inside of the car of two male occupants. She says, okay, and is that the position of Dominic and Davion's body that day that you recall? And he says, yes. Okay, and Officer Galassi, at any time during your investigation, were you able to depict that positioning in any other way? He says, yes, I was asked to draw it. I do want to note here that, like, this whole sketch thing, I know there's, like, people on the internet who are saying, oh, people, are drawing these sketches and it's disrespectful to the families. Nobody drew that sketch except the officers and law enforcement and the court that knew about it and etc. Like, no one did that to be disrespectful. And they're in the FOIA documents, so respectfully, they will be reviewed. He says, yes, I was asked to draw it. She says, why were you asked to draw it? The court says, can you establish who asked him? Ooh, Kupak says, who asked you to draw the positioning? He says, Detective Hazoo. Detective Hazoo is on my shit list. Yeah, he is. And it's historical to do so, right, Cree? Wonder if they blur the videos in court. I don't think so, Crystal. I don't think so. Hey, Laura. Hey, Edith. Okay, he says, Detective Hazoo. Do you recall why Detective Hazoo wanted you to create a drawing of the positioning of the bodies? He says, to note from my memory where the bodies were at the accident. She says, if I showed you a copy of that sketch, would you be able to identify it? He says, yes. Ms. Kupak then says, I'm going to show you State Exhibit 4. May I approach, Your Honor? The court says, yes, Officer Galassi. Officer Galassi, first, what you possess as State Exhibit 4, is it the same thing depicted on the screen? He responds, yes. She says, what is State's Exhibit 4? He says, the drawing of the bodies, where the bodies were in the car. She says, is that a fair and accurate depiction of the sketch that you provided to Detective Hazoo? She says, yes. And when did you provide that sketch to Detective Hazoo? Officer Galassi says, it's dated January 27th, 2023. So, am I tripping? 6 months after the crash. 6 months after the crash. Interesting. She says, are there any additional markings on this page? He says, signatures from myself, Detective Hazoo, and State's Exhibit number 4. She says, Officer Galassi, were you able to personally observe Mackenzie Shirilla on scene that day? Galassi says, yes. Kupak says, do you see Mackenzie Shirilla in the courtroom today? He says, yes. Mr. McDonald says, well, we'll stipulate. Kupak says, we had discussed this incident took place on the corner of Progress Drive and Alameda in Strongsville. Is that correct? He says, yes. What county is that in? He says, Cuyahoga. What state? Ohio. One moment, please, Your Honor. Nothing further at this time. The court says cross. And so now it's the cross-examination of Officer Michael Galassi by Ronald McDonald. Hey, Green. Although my morbid ass would watch. I know. Me too. Well, remember, they didn't think Kenzie was guilty until 3 months later. She gets arrested in November. Then they start the real investigation. So they want a sketch in January 2023. Make it make sense. Shouldn't that shit have been done before she got arrested in the investigation? Like, I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't even matter. I don't know. Not an officer, not a lawyer. I'm just a girl who loves true crime. But it seems a little odd. Hmm. I don't know. At the scene, right, Crystal? Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. 6 months later. Hmm. Okay. Let's move on. McDonald says, Officer, my name is Jim McDonald. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. If at any time you don't understand the question, ask me to rephrase it or repeat it. Fair enough? He says, Yes, sir. How long have you been with Strongsville? Galassi says, Over 5 years. Okay, and when you work at Patrol, do you work a particular sector of the city? He says, Yes. And have you worked the same sector for the last 5 years? No. Have you ever worked at a sector that includes where the incident took place? Galassi says yes. How long a period of time did you work that sector that included progress, roughly? He says, I'm unsure. At least a year? I do not recall. Do you do traffic? He says, yes. Traffic means speeding tickets. He says, yes. Do you ever give people speeding tickets on progress? I do not, he says. McDonald says, progress is a cut through, is it not? Galassi says, yes. What's the speed limit? Galassi says 35. Would it be fair to say, as they cut through, people tend to speed on that road, right? Galassi says, Are you asking my assumption, sir? The court says, You can't guess. McDonald says, What you observed. The court says, If you don't know, say you don't know. Galassi says, Can you rephrase the question, sir? He says, People use progress as a cut through to get from Pearl to 82, correct? Galassi says, Yes. People speed when they are on that portion of progress where this incident took place, right? Galassi says, You're asking for a yes or no answer, sir? Question mark. McDonald says, Yeah, I guess so. The court says, Only if you know. Galassi says, Yes. McDonald says, Yes, you know. And yes, people speed there? Galassi says, Yes. McDonald says, Okay, great. Pearl, were you ever sent there to do radar? He says, No, sir. Okay, do you know if anyone from Strongsville was? Galassi says, I do not know, sir. McDonald says, and exhibits 3 and 4, you have both of those in front of you. He says, No. He says, I have number 4. McDonald says, Number 3, I'll hand you. If you look at these two, would you agree that exhibit 4 really isn't as accurate as exhibit 3, right? Galassi says, Well, one is a hand drawing, sir, and one is a picture. McDonald says, I know. I got it. But exhibit 4, the hand drawing, it doesn't have Davion Flanagan or Dominic Russo even touching each other. When you look at exhibit 3, it's pretty clear that one is on top of the other, right? No way. How have I not? Have we noticed this before? Exhibit? I have them. I just have to pull them. I know one of them is a sketch. What picture? Ugh, I'll have to go through my MACKENZIE files. Interesting. He says, Well, one is a hand drawing, so one is a picture. McDonald says it doesn't have Flanagan or Dominic touching each other. When you look at exhibit 3, it's pretty clear that one is on top of the other, right? He says, Yes, it's a picture. McDonald says, No further questions. The court says, Redirect. Kupak says, Nothing based off that. The court says, You're all done. Thank you, sir. Wait, why? Why is that all McDonald has to ask? I'm going to pull those up. McDonald sucked ass, respectfully. We can all agree to that, right? Like, you don't have to like Mackenzie Shirley to think that to understand due process and be on the correct side of the law, right? Because essentially that's what we're here for, true crime and doing the right thing in cases. To infer his memory wasn't great, or to infer that things were different and changed and agreed upon. You already know what I think about this trial in this case. Um, McDonald is a douche. Yeah, he is. Respectfully. Well, at least in this trial he was. He says, okay, so let's move on. Thereupon the witness was excused. The court says, who's the next witness? Kupak says, thank you, Your Honor. The state at this time calls Officer Brett Robinson. Okay, so he gets sworn in. Direct examination of Brett Robinson. This is another officer. Kupak says, good afternoon. He says, good afternoon. Could you please state and spell your first name? Okay, Brett Robinson. Officer, are you employed? Yes. Where are you employed? Strongsville Police Department. How long have you been employed by Strongsville Police Department? He says, I have been there for just under 3 years. Kupak says, were you employed anywhere before you were employed with Strongsville? He says, yes, I was at the Parma Police Department for 3 years. Ah, Parma. Isn't that interesting? Brett Robinson, Parma Police Department. We're definitely familiar with Parma. That's the shortest questioning ever. The prosecution had like, I think 20 something witnesses, and McDonald only had 3 for Kenzie's trial. It was absolutely a joke. Oh, I didn't turn on my lights. 1 second. Wow. Yeah. She says, and first, if you could tell us what was your title that you held while at Parma Police Department? He says, basic patrol. She says, with Strongsville? Robinson says, basic patrol. Kupak says, did you undergo any sort of training or specifications to become a police officer? He says, yes. What are those certifications? He says, the police academy. Okay, anything additional? He says, CIT training, and we usually have annual training in certain subjects. She says, what is CIT training? He says, crisis intervention training. All of our police officers, including myself, were trained in that. Kupak says, are you up to date on all of your trainings and certifications? He says, yes. Officer Robinson, if you could explain for the court what your daily duties are as a Strongsville police officer. He says, sure, I work permanent night shift. We're assigned a zone for the night, and we're responsible for any calls in service, patrolling our neighborhoods, as well as other things. She says, okay, Officer Robinson, were you employed and working on July 31st of 2022? He says, yes. She says, what zone were you working that day? He says, I do not remember exactly what zone I was working, but I was working night shift that night. She says, okay, while on shift then, did you have the opportunity to respond to the intersection of Progress and Alameda Drive? He says, I did. She says, if you could walk us through how you came to respond to that location. He says, sure. I responded from the police station. I drove northbound on Pearl Road and then took a left to go westbound onto Progress Drive. She says, if you could explain for the court approximately how many times had you been up Progress Drive before in your capacity as a policeman? He says, I would say hundreds. We typically get alarm calls. It's a commercial area of the city where we get a lot of alarm calls on night shift, in addition to normal duties of drive-through and checking businesses. She says, and based on your experiences driving Progress Drive to Alameda, could you describe for the court the dynamics of the road? He says, sure. It's a concrete paved road. It's one of our older paved roads in the city. I would say it's got some wear and tear to it. You don't say. Now, do you, Officer Robinson? Because remember, this road got fixed after the fact. So when the judge went out there and drove it, this was already fixed because they wanted to cover up the potholes and the shitty road that could have possibly led to something that caused the crash. I know, don't get upset, don't get mad. The road was redone, and it's clearly stated here that it was not a legitimate road. So when the judge went out there, it was perfect. It was redone. It was brand new. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. You can tell there's a certain section of the concrete that are raised, so it's a little bit difficult driving. I would say, like the speed limit down the road. You can feel the bumps as you're driving in your cruiser. Ah, this is interesting. I haven't read these. So I took screenshots of the videos I saw and it was not pretty at all. I actually saw faces. 3 witnesses sounds like a weak ass defense. Yeah, it was. Mm, so my dad is a retired engineer for the highway department and said that's sketchy AF. Yeah, they did. Probably not a coincidence, but those are the risks when you're speeding, says Peach. Those same things, those same potholes, chuck holes, whatever they call them, those things could have contributed to when she airborne and the airbags went off, and it could have all played a role. She says, when you drive onto Drive from Pearl Road, it goes from east to west, and there's a series of curves that you will experience in the roadway. Once you get to the end of Progress, it's a T intersection. There's a street that runs into Alameda, and Progress Drive has a lot of businesses. It's a commercial area of the city. There's a lot of businesses. I believe it is a lit roadway at nighttime. That's what he says. Kupak says, Officer Robinson, what type of vehicle do you drive in the capacity as a policeman? He says, typically a Dodge Charger. We also have Ford Explorers. That night, I was driving one of our newer Chargers, which is a rear wheel drive Dodge Charger. Kupak says, and as a policeman in the city of Strongsville, driving those vehicles, are they equipped with any type of camera equipment? He says, yes, they have dash cameras that will show the speed, acceleration, braking, the dash view, as well as the rear of the vehicle. If you have an inmate in the back, somebody in the back seat, it will show a view of that as well as some of the rear window footage. She says, okay, can you explain for the court how those videos became activated? He says there's different ways. We can do it manually while responding to a call. If we're responding to a sort of a medical emergency or a domestic or a call serious in nature where we're going lights and sirens, it will automatically activate it. She says, were you aware of it if on July 31st, 2022, your front and rear end cameras were activated? He says, yes. She says, if I showed you a copy of your front camera view, would you be able to identify it? He says, yes. Kupak says, for the record, I'm going to play States Exhibit 7. For the record, this video is going to be less than 2 minutes long. So then they play a video. McDonald says, this is the dash cam. Kupak says, correct. So the video gets played. She says, I am now pausing it at 4 seconds. Officer Robinson, what is depicted on the scene? He says, this is the intersection of Pearl Road and Progress as I'm making a left-hand turn from Pearl Road to go westbound onto Progress. She says, what are we watching? He said, this is my dash camera footage from my cruiser. She says, thank you. We have it paused here. It's kind of hard to see. On the left-hand side, I'm going to draw your attention. What do you see on the left-hand side of the screen, if you can describe for the court? He says, it shows the car is obviously running. I'm braking currently, and it will indicate whether my lights are on, lights and sirens, whether my door is open, and whether I crash into something or my shotgun button has been activated. It also indicates speed as well. She says, where does it indicate speed? He says, in the bottom right-hand corner. She says, in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, what is depicted? He says, GPS coordinates. All of our vehicles will show our GPS coordinates. She says, you stated you were about to turn onto Progress Drive from Pearl. He says, yes. She says, can you read for the record what the speed is at this time? He says, 29 miles per hour. So now they play State Exhibit 7. She says, Officer Robinson, what are all these lane markers you're passing on the right-hand side for the record? He says, several businesses that are on Progress. She says, for the record, could you read for the record what your speed is at this point? He says, 54 miles per hour. She says, "What are you passing on the right-hand side?" He says, "Another business." She says, "Do you recall what that business is?" Officer says, "I cannot recall." She says, "For the record, what speed are you at now?" He says, "Approximately 50 miles per hour and decreasing my speed as I am approaching the scene." She says, stopping the video and concluding it at 1 minute and 9 seconds. Officer Robinson, is that a fair and accurate depiction of your front dash camera from July 31st of 2022? He says, yes. She says, for the record, one more time, while driving up Progress Drive, what is the high speed that you reached? He said 54 miles per hour. She says, Officer Robinson, if you can explain for the court, why did you not drive faster than 54 miles per hour that day? He says, given the conditions of the roadway, I thought it was the safest speed that I could respond to that emergency call. Interesting. So you can't even speed on that road, it seems like, without it possibly being an issue. But that argument maybe covered intent, like she intended to speed, not to unalive the boys. Exactly. Exactly, Peach. Like, the airbags deployed, remember, we don't know what was going on in the car. We only have a few seconds bef before the crash. We don't have anything other than that. Huh. That's that's crazy. She says, "Do you recall if you've ever driven 54 miles an hour down that road before July 31st of 2022?" He says, "No." She says, "Can you explain it if you had to take any precautionary measures while you were driving 54 miles per hour on Progress Drive?" He says, "Yes, I had to hold on to the steering wheel to make sure that I was in control." Okay, so maybe Kenzie was speeding and they lost control. The road doesn't help. The whole trigger event situation doesn't help. The airbags doesn't help. The curb doesn't help. The sign doesn't help. The airborne doesn't help. He had to hold on to the steering wheel to make sure that he was in control. He says, "It's a rough road." Especially at those speeds, you really got to be aware of the elements. And at a certain point, you experience a curve. So you have to keep in mind while you're going accelerated speed on that road, you have to be fully controlled, almost using two hands with the steering wheel while being able to respond to the radio. Wow. And if Kenzie's little ass gets hit with those airbags, shit, that girl flying all the way, you know what I mean, out, like, she's tiny, respectfully is what I'm trying to say. Tiny girl. I will never believe it was intentional at all. No proof, in my opinion, of that at all. I agree creatively. All things created with love says, I saw a drone video of the road from the beginning and it was close, not sure date of that video. Green says, I don't think intent was there and this guy just proved it. Galassi says, Kupak says, Officer Robinson, if I showed you a copy of your rear dash cam, would you be able to recognize it? He says, yes. Kupak says, this is going to be State's Exhibit A. Again, this is less than 2 minutes long. So they play another video. She says, pausing the video at 1 second. Officer Robinson, do you recognize State's Exhibit 8? He says, yes. She says, what is State Exhibit 8? He says, this is rear camera in my patrol vehicle. She says, I'm stopping the video and completing the video at 1 minute and 5 seconds for the record. Officer Robinson, is that a fair and accurate depiction of the rear dash camera on your vehicle on July 31st of 2022? He says, yes, it is. She says, Officer Robinson, were you able to arrive at the scene of the crash on July 31st? He says, yes. She says, could you just briefly explain for the court what you observed when you arrived? He says, when I arrived, Patrolman Galassi and his trainee were already on the scene at the crash site. I approached, and at that moment, there was another officer that arrived too, Patrolman Valco. At this point, we were attempting to gain entry into the vehicle by using a window breaking device. Patrolman Valco was able to break open one of the windows, and I was able to open one of the doors. When I opened the door and we had removed one of the airbags from the vehicle, we were able to see both Dominic and Davion, which they appeared to be deceased, and we were able to see Mackenzie in the driver's seat. She appeared to be stuck underneath the dash, facing down in her lap. Mm. A part of me thinks like if Kenzie knew she was gonna possibly die, she was like, "I'm doing this. I'm unaliving them both, and I know that I might go with them. I might, I might be deceased too." Like, why would she be ducking down? It's almost like with the Lindsay Clancy case. She's a nurse, and if she was really trying to unalive herself, she knows exactly where to cut to unalive herself. And she didn't. She survived. Not that I'm saying anything bad here. I'm just saying. Um, I think they lost control and she didn't know what to do and she ducked. And the airbags hit her, who knows? She loved herself way too much. Those airbags knocked her out first, I'm betting. Yeah. You know, I have a friend who got out in a car accident recently and it was at least nothing happened to her, but I want to say she said the airbag, I think, broke her nose. Something happened to her nose. Um, are they that strong to break noses? I'm sure. Clancy is guilty. I'm sorry, says B12. B12, come to the live after this because we're going to be covering Lindsay Clancy. But not if she was in psychosis and remember she had brain fog. Maybe Kenzie had brain fog too. You know what I'm saying? Yep, very well could be. And it's enough for some reasonable doubt for sure. I had my side bag airbags go off after being T-boned. I didn't even feel them. Meaning like they didn't do anything, or meaning like they knocked you out and you didn't feel them. Yes, I've heard of them breaking noses. Maybe she just kept her foot on the pedal because slow reaction time. So she appeared to be stuck underneath the dash facing down in her lap. He says at one point we figured out her name and we began to calling her name because we weren't sure. She appeared to be unresponsive at first. I saw one of her legs move and she did like a grunting noise. That's when we discovered she was responsive enough to respond to the things we were saying to her. Did you hear her say anything personally? He says no, other than like the grunting type noise. Kupak says, one moment, please. Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you. The court says cross, and now it's cross examination. I have a lot more questions. Like, I would have even done a better job being on this case. Like, I have a lot of questions for these officers. Hello? Robinson? Galassi? I have more questions than the own damn prosecutor or lady speaking. Why? How is that even possible? I have like a zillion questions more about the scene. I'm the brain fog queen and haven't killed anybody yet. Hey Melly, your mods love you guys. Hi Melissa, love you too, hon. Same. Yeah. She called herself Baby Kush. A lot of rug dealing. She was a mule. Oh my god, I actually, without respectfully, Anthony, I had to actually laugh at that comment. Like, I couldn't even hold it in anymore. She was not the mule. Okay, I've already said this before. Kenzie is not my uncle El Chapo. Like, they're not one and the same. Like, she was not the mule. Okay. Kenzie was not. No, she's not. No one, never. I wouldn't. You can never convince me of this. Well, wait. You mean meal as in like working for someone? Yes. Not her own. Like she wasn't the one who has come up with these ideas on her own. Okay. Respectfully, Kenzie a baddie and she's all these things, but um Yes. Oh, that's what you mean. Okay, a mule for someone else. Yes. I thought you were meaning like she's the mule, like she's the rug dealer here. Which, don't get me wrong, I know she was participating in it. But I thought you were saying she's the one who started. Kenzie got ain't got the sophistication. Listen, hey Kalina. That's funny. Okay. Anyways, now that we cleared that up. Yeah, but still, Kenzie is not Chapo. He says, my name is Jim McDonald, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions. If at any time you don't understand the question, just ask me to repeat or rephrase it. Fair enough? He says, yes. Do you know how many airbags were deployed? He says, I'm not certain how many. All I know, the side that I was on, the vehicle airbags were deployed. Kupak says, and the side that you were on was a driver's side? He says, the driver's side and the back left driver's side. So Kenzie's and where Davion was sitting. Right? That would be the back left. She says, so you know of the two airbags? He says, yes. Driver's front, driver's rear. He said, yes. She says, right? He says, yes, as well. I'm sorry, the airbag that was on the steering wheel as well. So Kenzie got hit with the side bags, the steering wheel. I think the force of impact in the airbags is what made Davion, RIP Davion and Dom, be in the positions that they were in. Yeah, apparently. Also, yes, she was a meal for Dom. That's what I was trying to say. Why I said I'm laughing at Anthony was because I thought you were saying that she was like the rug dealer, like the big old dog in this game. She wasn't. She just was helping her boyfriend. She was a meal for Dom hiding stuff on her while they drove around, but we cannot talk about how horrible of her position he put her in that way. Period. Melissa Hurts. Period. You're not wrong. You're absolutely not wrong. And listen, at the end of the day, I'm gonna sound like Steve Shirley here. So I gotta be careful what I say. And I mean that I don't want to sound like I'm saying like, oh, okay, be a drug dealer. Like that doesn't change the fact that Dom was still a victim to me and that they were both dealing with a lot of trauma and that this could have many things can be true here with this case. And I've said it many times before, right? Like I think they were both just in environments where they didn't thrive. Nothing good. I don't necessarily think it's Kenzie and Dom's fault, unfortunately. Who am I blaming? Well, I guess no one in particular or everyone in particular. I think they just were both caught up in stuff that proves there was some kind of trauma and different lifestyle than I think what young adults get involved in, and rugs and, you know, parents not being around much. Thankfully, I've never had them go off just my side ones. Yeah, this is a case with this and so many factors against them all. Yeah, and, you know, I don't know. It makes me sad for both of them, to be honest. As someone from Ohio, Ohio is trauma. I just think if they were both in different environments, maybe this could have been avoided altogether. And that's not to shit on the Shirillas or anyone else. It's just to say that, like, you know, they were kind of a product of their environment and put him on this path of like the fast life and rugs and popular and money and family trauma and it just sucks. Ohio's a little more rough than I realized too. I've heard that. I've heard that. He says, well, I'm sorry, the airbag that was on the steering wheel as well. She says, now we know 3 for sure. He says, yes. Kupak says, "You're not sure about the other side because you didn't look at it or you just don't remember." He says, "There were other officers on the side of the vehicle. I cannot recall whether those airbags were deployed or not." She says, "It wasn't your duty or part of your job that day, right?" He says, "I'm sorry." She says, "It wasn't part of what you were doing. You were focused on the driver's side." He says, "Yes." She says, "Okay, Miss Shirilla was unresponsive when you first got there." He says, "Correct. She appeared to be." He says, "Do you know how long of a period of a time when you arrived until she responded?" He says, "I'm not sure." Lots of "I'm not sure's." Kupak says, "Your testimony was at 54 miles per hour. It was difficult to negotiate the road." He says, "Yes." She says, "The speed there is 35 miles per hour." He says, "Yes." She says, "And when you drove it back that day, the road was not in good condition, right?" He says, "Yes." "Cars would go up and down in dips." He says, "Yes." Wait, this is crazy. The speeding, the nighttime, the possible whatever was going on, whether it was pots, whether they were fighting, whether it was this, whether it was that, driving on this type of road, yeah, no wonder. Sounds like a shitty road. It's all around a really effed up situation. This case is one of the most polarizing currently out there. I just think they both deserved better. All three of them did. And that means no disrespect to the families in general. It just means, you know, there's a lot going on here. I'm not sure is reasonable doubt. Exactly, Jen. She says pavement didn't match. The concrete slabs were different. He says correct. She says there was a curve. He says, uh-huh. Sir, we're going to need you to respond with yes or no, please, in the courtroom. Thank you. We need to make it clear for the record. Why is he replying with uh-huh? She says, "We heard the testimony already. There was a significant number of people that used that as a cut through and would speed." He said, "Yes." Thank you. She says, "Would you say 54 miles per hour is reckless on that road?" He says, "I would say that's excessive." She says, "Excessive. It has to be a little faster to be excessive, right?" He says, "The speed limit is 35. It's kind of borderline reckless." She says, "Okay. And we saw when you negotiated that turn, the minute that you completed that turn, you were going 35 miles per hour, right?" He says, "I believe so." The court says, "Which turn are you talking about?" He says, "The turn onto progress." Oh, wait. Kupak says, "The turn onto progress." He says, "I was coming down from Pearl." She says, "You were doing 35 as you made that turn?" He says, "Roughly 30, 35." McDonald says, "Nothing further." The court says, "Redirect." She says, "Nothing based off that." Now the next witness is called. Um, Captain Brett Stanislaw from Berea Fire Department is the next witness. And here's a direct examination of Brett. Gas, brake, dip in my E40 was. He's about to get a traffic ticket right now in court. Literally a ticket right now. Every time Melly says Tupac, I hear Tupac. Am I even saying that right? R.I.P. Tupac. I love Tupac. Hi, Vicky. My dad says the road changes everything. She could easily have lost control and then fixing it quickly. He thinks there's some family influence at play here. It's easy to lose control. I drove home to my parents yesterday, which is why I didn't go live, and there was, like, what do you call it? Like a pothole. They have a pothole on one of the main roads out there. I don't understand why they're not fixing it, but, it seems like it's been 1,000 years. And that even kind of made me, like, go all over the place. Was I speeding? Not gonna self-snitch here, but, I did go over it, and it yanked my tire, if you know what I mean. The video I saw was exactly like that, big different slabs of road. I didn't see a lot of potholes, but definitely different slabs, which means not smooth. Yeah. Um, Melly, he said usually special families. Yeah, exactly. Excuse me while I take a drink of my Buzzball. Okay. Um, Kupak says, "Good morning." He says, "Good morning." She says, "Okay, state and spell your name." Okay, we know what it. Oh, sorry, my mouse. Brett. Okay, Brett. He says, "I'm the captain with the Berea Fire Department." She says, "Captain, how long have you been employed with Berea Fire Department?" He says, "I have been employed with Berea Fire Department as a fireman in August of 2005." She says, "Are you employed anywhere else?" He says, "Yes, I am captain for the Brooklyn Heights Fire Department in a part-time capacity and have been there since 2004." She says, "Okay, how long have you been a captain for?" He says, "I have been a captain probably the last 8 years now." She says, "Did you first have to undergo any special training or certification?" He says, "Yes, I went to EMT basic school. I went to the fire academy through Cuyahoga County Community College and the University Hospital's paramedic program." She says, "How long have you been a paramedic for?" He says, "I have been certified since 2003." So what is that, 19 years? "How long have you been an EMT for?" He says, "Probably a prior year to that, so 2002." Yeah, because this trial's in 2003. Was it 2003? Yeah. "Do you have any additional ongoing trainings?" He says, "Yes, you have to maintain paramedic card every 3 years. So there's continuing education. I'm also on the Cuyahoga County Hazardous Materials team. So I am a hazardous materials and weapons of mass destruction technician, fire safety inspector, and fire instructor." She says, "Are you familiar with the term medical control?" He says, "Medical control?" "Yes." She says, "What is medical control?" Officer or Fireman Robinson says, "We operate under Southwest General Hospital. That is our medical director slash medical commander. They're the ones that give us approved parameters or protocols, and we are to operate and conduct patient treatment within those guidelines." She says, "Are you familiar with the term BLS?" He says, "That is basic life support." She says, "And are you certified in basic life support?" He says, "Yes." She says, "And are you familiar with the term ACS?" He says, "ACLS?" She says, "Yes." He says, "Advanced cardiac life support." She says, "Are you also certified in advanced cardiac life support?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Are you familiar with the term PALS?" He says, "Pediatric advanced life support." She says, "Are you also certified in pediatric advanced life support as well?" He says, "Yes." Didn't he just say that? She says, "Are you up to date on all of your training and certifications?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Can you explain for the court your daily duties?" He says, "I am the A shift or line captain, meaning that I work on shift schedule, so I am the A shift captain. My day begins at 8 in the morning. It is 24 hours and continues to 8 in the morning the next morning. My responsibilities are first and foremost responding to incidents. I give daily assignments to all members that are on my shift. I'm in charge of running incidents until the chief relieves me, carry out all of my inspections that occur, just day-to-day station operations." She says, "Can I ask you to slow down for the court reporter?" He says, "Sure, sorry." She says, "Can you describe for the court what a response call or a response to a call for service is like in the Berea Fire Department?" He says, "It depends on the call or what the nature of the call is. If it sounds like a minor medical incident, we would just dispatch our squad with 3 personnel if it is inside the city. If it is major," the court says, "slow down. You're going way too fast for her." He says, "If it's a major medical response, then that would have an engine ambulance responder. If it is a fire call or an MVA or odor of natural gas inside of a structure, that would be the entire duty shift." She says, "Is there a time where Berea Fire has to assist other municipalities on that call?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Can you explain that to the court?" He says, "There are 2 forms of assistance that our department officers make up. One is typically for smaller scale incident if they just need a single resource like mutually aid body cameras. If there is a larger scale incident that is high severity or higher possibility of severity, that would be dispatched automatically. That's typically, sorry, I have to sneeze. Okay, excuse me, I had to sneeze. He says, if there's a larger scale incident that is higher severity or higher possibility or severity that would be dispatched automatically. That's typically reserved for a box alarm or structure or fire or technical rescue. She says, once you respond to a scene, can you explain for the court how your department documents those responses and actions? He says, we're a member of Southwest Dispatch Center. They keep track of our times. We are notified by a station alert tone inside our station, and we have to acknowledge it over a local station radio. And when we are responding, we have a CAD computer. It is a touch screen that you timestamp when you are responding, when you are on scene, when you are released, or any period of the call. She says, does that documentation have a name? He says, it would just be your dispatch log. She says, are there any specific reports that you generate while on scene? He says, yes. If it is a medical call, it is a patient care report as well as an NFIRS report. If it is simply a structure fire, then it's just an NFIRS report. She says, what is that? National Fire Incident Reporting System. She says, is that what the NFIRS means? He says, correct. She says, what is that report? He says, it's a report that summarizes the entire explanation and documents the entire incident. It tracks our response times on the scene, any pertinent benchmarks. There is a narrative section to explain any of the actions we took to mitigate a situation. She says, what does a patient care report document? He says a patient care report documents the time of the call, just like the NFIRS report does. But then it is also used for documenting medical care and assessment. I'm just reading your comments. Yeah. Imagine a quilted blanket, best way to describe the road. Yeah. She says, Captain, were you on duty on July 31st, 2022? He says, yes. She says, did you have the opportunity to respond to a call at the intersection of Progress Drive and Alameda in Strongsville, Ohio? He says, yes. She says, first of all, can you explain why Berea Fire Department responded to that call in Strongsville? He says, I'm not sure why. We were needed because there was 3 patients, I believe, at the time of the call. This is how the call came in. It required additional assistance that was above and beyond what Strongsville Fire had the capability of providing. She says, can you explain for the court what you did when you arrived on the scene? He says, when I arrived on the scene, I advised my crew to stay with the ambulance. I contacted the incident commander for the city of Strongsville Fire Department, and he placed us in a staging area and advises that we would be rendering treatment to the driver of the vehicle who was still being extricated. She says, did you in fact service treatment to the driver of the vehicle? He says, yes. She says, were you able to determine what her name was? He says, yes. He says, do you recall her name at the time? He says, MACKENZIE. Captain, how were you able, strike that, were you able to document your treatment of MACKENZIE in any way that day? He says, yes, patient care report. She says, if I showed you a copy of that patient care report, would you be able to recognize it? He says, yes. She says, may I approach, Your Honor? The court says, yes. She says, Captain, I'm handing you what has marked as State's Exhibit 9. First, what is State's Exhibit 9? He says, this is a printed copy of our electronic patient care report. She says, is that what you have in your possession on the stand? State's Exhibit 9, the same thing as depicted here on the screen? He says, yes. She says, Captain Stanislaw, I'm first going to direct your attention to the first page of the patient care report. I'm going to direct your attention to the top of the screen underneath where it says UH Berea Fire. Do you see that? He says, yes. She says, can you read for the record what the date is on your patient care report? He says, July 31st, 2022. She says, can I draw your attention to the right-hand portion of the screen here? Start with the call received. Do you see where I am looking? He says, yes. She says, if you could walk the court through what that right-hand section means and what the times are that are marked. He says, call received would be when the city of Strongsville received the call. We were dispatched when mutual aid was requested at 6:28. En route is when we are leaving the station. On scene is when we arrive on the scene. Patient contact is when we begin rendering patient care. She says, for the record, what time was the call received on July 31st? He says the call was received at 6:21. She says, "What time were you dispatched?" He says 6:28. "And what time did you arrive?" He says 6:29. "On scene." He says 6:37. She says, "What time did you make contact with Mackenzie?" He says 6:48. So over an hour after the crash is when they finally got to Mackenzie. Thanks, Ramon. That's an hour. She says, "I'm going to draw your attention to the bottom portion of this report of the first page still. It says patient information. Do you see that?" He says, "Yes." She says, "If you could read for the court the information that you documented from that day." He says, "Mackenzie Shirilla." She says, "Date of birth, August 8, August 2nd, 2004. She says, "I'm going to continue to move down. We are on the second page. I'm going to stop at the second page where it says protocol 2. Do you see where it says protocol 2? He says, "Yes." She says, "Captain, under assessment, can you read for the record what the four categories are?" He says, "First, 648, ABC, meaning airway, breathing, and circulation." She says, "Who was the employee here doing the assessment?" He says, "Myself." She says, "You said it says ABC, is that correct?" He said, "Yes." She says, "What does ABC stand for?" He says, "Airway, meaning having patient air, patent airway. Breathing is the patient breathing, and circulation if the patient has a pulse." She says, "Were you able to perform the ABC test on Mackenzie?" He says, "Yes." She says, "If you could go over what the results were of that ABC test." He says, "The air was patent. Her breathing rate was normal and appeared unlabored. Both lungs sounded both lung sounds were present. Circulation, she had a pulse. Capillary refill was normal. Skin color normal. Skin temperature normal. Skin condition was normal." She says, "What does patent airway mean?" He says that you're capable of breathing. She says, "I'm going to take you down to the next section where it says 648. He says, "Can you read?" She says, "Can you read that section?" He says, "Neurological and AVPU." She says, "What does that stand for?" He says, "That is a way of classifying someone's mental status. A is alert, V is verbal, P is for pain, and U is for unresponsive." She says, "Were you able to still perform the AVPU test on Miss Shirilla?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Can you explain the scale for us, how that works?" He says, "That scale, you're falling into four categories. One is alert. That would be how you and I are just conducting the conversation with somebody that is paying attention to what is going on around them. Verbal would be to elicit some sort of stimuli or response to the individual where you'd have to say something to them. That would be pain would be you would have to produce some sort of painful stimulus. It's a response. Unresponsive is if the individual does not respond to the three previous tests." She says, "What was the finding for Miss Shirilla for the AVPU?" He says, "She was alert." She says, "I'm sorry." He says, "She was alert." He says, Kupak says, "Can you read that?" He says, "Okay, mental status, normal." He says, She says, "I'm going to direct your attention to the AVPU. What did you determine her to be?" He says, "Verbal." "Why was she verbal?" Captain says, "When we first took patient care of her, she didn't have her eyes open. When we asked her for a question, or 'Are you okay? What hurts?' we were getting a verbal response back." She says, "Below AVPU, it says mental status. Do you see where I'm looking?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Walk us through the testing and what the results were." He says, "Mental status normal. She was not combative. She was confused." I assume she was typically not confused, just given the age and no medical ID bracelets indicating any type of deficit or medical condition. She was not hallucinating. So she was confused, like Lindsay Clancy confused when allegedly Patrick talked to her, but allegedly she couldn't talk, but allegedly she said in the basement, but allegedly we don't even know. And mental status, like I hope that they just mean like basic mental status. Cause excuse me, what do you mean mental status, sir? One, you're not even qualified for mental health stuff. Two, wasn't she unresponsive? She was I thought for a period of time. Again, they didn't get to her until an hour later. That's enough time for things to change. Um, she says, "You said there was no bracelets or indications of." Can you repeat what you just said? He says there was like no medical alert tags or bracelet or any type of necklace or jewelry that would indicate a medical problem that I saw. She says, "Is that something you would typically look for on a patient?" Captain says, "Yes." She says, "Go ahead." He says, "Mental status normal, was not combative, confused." Yes. Mental status normal, but she's confused. So it's not normal because she's confused. She was disoriented. She said, "Jacob." So how was she oriented? Exactly. Hi, Melanie. Respectfully. Yeah. Abuelita. He says, "Confused, yes." Was that normal for patient? No. Oh, thank you for proving what I just said right. Was that normal for patient? No. No. He says, "Hallucination, no. Oriented to event, no. Oriented to event, normal for patient, yes. I assume she was driving a vehicle." McDonald says, "Objection to what he assumed." The court says, "Sustained." The court says, "You can say why you said that, but you can't say that you assumed." Kupak says, "You stated oriented to place." Captain says, "Oriented to place, no. Normal for patient, yes. Oriented to time, yes. Unresponsive, no." She says, "Captain, where it says mental status, normal, can you explain why that was your finding?" He says, "Because she didn't have her eyes open when we first contacted her. We require some stimuli, and we were asking questions. Do you remember what happened? She was confused as to what the events were." So she was confused, which means if she made it up and was being a spiteful, evil bitch and lied, she would remember, you know? "Hey, living life, good to see you, love." Why is she asking him these irrelevant questions? Like, do you know what PLS is? You know what, mothership? Good question. How does that mean mental status normal? It makes no sense to me. Makes no sense to me. She was confused as to what the events were, just like Lindsay Clancy was confused allegedly to what the events were. Hmm. But we can give her a pass. Okay. Okay, I'll calm down. I'll calm down. It's gonna get hot and heavy in here real quick. Um, I am not being a hater. I'm not being a hater. He says she was confused as to what the events were. He says, "Okay, below all of these categories that you just read, it says neurological. Can you see that?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Can you read what the results were overall for neurological?" He says, "Normal." She says, "Can you explain to the court how some of the answers for what you had stated above were no, but all her neurological function was normal?" He says neurological functioning is pulse, motor, and sensation in her four extremities. We checked that on an individual that was in trauma to see if there was any spinal cord injuries. Was there loss of movement, sensation, or feeling in any of their extremities? That's what that meant. He says, "Captain, if a person was suffering from any significant neurological emergency at that time, would that neurological or neuro be normal?" He says, "No." She says, "If a person was suffering a stroke, would that read as all neuro normal?" He says, "No." She says, "If a person was suffering a seizure, would that read all as neuronormal?" He says, "No." She says, "If a person was suffering a heart attack, would that read all neuronormal?" He says, "It would depend on their symptoms. They could be normal." Wait, so she could have a heart attack and then her symptoms can be normal, right? Because they didn't get to her for an hour later. Am I reading that right? If a person was suffering a heart attack, would that read all normal? He says it would depend on their symptoms. They could be normal. For a heart attack, he said? He says yes. Can you explain that? He says for a heart attack, yes, they could have feeling and proper movement in all their extremities and still be suffering a heart attack. She says, "Thank you. Captain, I'm going to move you down to the next section. Can you explain can you explain the results of the injury section?" He says, "First one, the injury arm, upper right, closed fracture, angulated right arm with obvious fracture, distal radial pulse present. Second one is injury, lower leg, right. Injury was a fracture, closed, possible right femur fracture, and obvious right dislocated kneecap." She says, "What do those two injuries mean in layman's terms?" He says, "Broken bones." She says, "The next question, head to toe. Do you see that?" He says, "Yes." She says, "If you could read the captions and explain to us your analysis of Mackenzie Shirilla's injuries that day." He says, "On the head to toe?" She says, "Yes." He says, "Head and neck normal. Left eye was reactive properly. Right eye was reactive properly. Neck was normal. Chest and back were normal. Abdomen and left or upper quadrant was normal. The right upper quadrant was not normal. There was tenderness upon palpitation. Left lower quadrant was normal. Right lower quadrant was normal. Pelvis was normal. Arms and legs. Left arm was normal. Right arm, no. Left leg normal. Right leg other, yes. She says, "I'm going to bring you to the next page. I believe that's the last page that you have." He says, "Yes." She says, "There are some other indications. It says BP and pulse. Do you see that?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Can you read the time and explain to us what BP means?" He says 649, and it is a patient's blood pressure. It was 157 over 125. She says, "Captain, what traditionally is a normal blood pressure?" He says 120 over 8 is determined normal. She says, "What is next?" He says pulse of 60. "What is normal?" He says 60 to 100. She says, "And there's a section that says Glasgow coma score. Can you explain what that is?" He says, "That's another way of judging patients' mental capacity or mental cognition. The E stands for eyes, the V stands for verbal, and the M stands for motor." She says, "There are numbers next to E, V, and M." He says, "That is how you score the different numbers." He says, "With different levels. The highest in the E section is 4. The highest that you can get in the verbal section is 5, and the highest you can get in motor is 6." She says, "After evaluating Mackenzie Shirla, what were her scores for E, V, and M?" He says 3, 4, and 6. Um, hmm. She says after evaluating, 3, 4, 6. 3 meaning she was not spontaneously opening her eyes because we had to speak to her and ask her a question to get her to answer. That rendered a 4. Verbal, if somebody is accurately able to give you all of the information exactly like where they are at and what happened and what's occurred, that would be a 5 because they are alert to the event. She was given a 4 because she was confused on some of the issues. She says, "Was she able to respond to the majority of your questions?" He says, "Yes." She says, "What is and the M for motor?" He says, "Motor 6. She was able to move all her extremities." She says, "What's the total score a person can get on the Glasgow coma score?" Is it yeah, she says, "What is the highest that you can get?" He says 50. What was her total score? He says 15. 15. Hmm. Um, Let me look that up. Okay, so that means highest possible score, meaning a person is fully awake. She says next section, what was her blood pressure at 657? He says 144 over 111. Her pulse 90. And SpO2, do you see that? He says, "Yes." She says, "What is it?" He says, "The blood oxygen saturation that is measured through finger probe we use on our monitor." She says, what is a typical level for a normal functioning individual?" He says, 95 or above. She says, "What can affect somebody's blood ox level?" He says, "Temperature, nail polish." She says, "Did you say nail polish?" He said, "It's a clamp that goes over the top of your finger. There's some sort of light that goes through both sides. Sometimes that can have an issue if not placed on properly. If somebody has poor circulation, if their hands are cold, or their body shunted blood back from their core from their extremities." She says, "What was Mackenzie's blood ox level at that time?" He says 82. So it was low. "Captain, before we get down to where it says narrative history, do you see where it says treatment?" He says, "Yes." "What does it say?" He says, "First treatment section says IV insertion. The second, he says cardiac monitor applied." She says, "What is a cardiac monitor?" He says, "A device through electrodes. It's the electrical activity in somebody's heart." Wait, which one? I'm confused with the comments. Um, Her blood pressure is high AF. Is that what you said? So the oxygen level of 82, that is dangerously low. He's right. It's between 95 and 100%. It means that your body and your vital organs are not getting enough oxygen to function properly. 82 is quite compromised. Yeah. She was bent over for a while, so not surprised she couldn't breathe at all. Yeah, I know. The blood pressure was high. Maybe she was in shock, I guess. Yeah. Interesting how they. Hmm. He says, somebody's heart. She says, "What were the results of the cardiac monitor that was applied to Miss Shirilla?" He says, "A sinus rhythm was normal heart rate. Her heart was her heart rate was normal." He says, "Yes." She says, "I'm going to draw your attention to where it says narrative history text. Do you see that?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Can you explain for the court what that is?" He says, that is the narrative section of the report that allows us to explain an overall story of what occurred when we were at the incident." She says, "In this narrative history text, if there was any current urgent neurological or health situation that was happening, would you document it in this section?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Was there anything going on at the time that you documented in this section as far as any neurological emergency?" He says, "There was nothing along the lines of that we determined as a neurological disorder of seizure or stroke." Is that what you're asking? She says, "Yeah, that's what I'm asking." He says, "No." She says, "There was no signs of seizure or stroke. Therefore, it was not included in that narrative." He says, "Yes." She says, "Captain, were you able to perform a head to toe exam for Mackenzie Shirilla on July 31st?" He says, "Yes." She says, "During that assessment or head to toe assessment, did anything significant happen?" He says, "Yes, I found some sort of baggie with substance in it and a black plastic case that I removed from her during the examination of the chest area." She says, "Let me first ask you, where were you at when you were performing this head to toe examination?" He says, "In the back of the ambulance." "Back of the what?" He says, "Ambulance." "You said first you located a baggie of substance. Is that what you said?" He says, "Yes, a baggie of some substance that was in there." She says, "What did that substance look like?" He says, "It looked like mushrooms to me." She says, "And are you familiar with what mushrooms are?" He says, "I've come across them on calls." She says, "Where did you locate this bag at?" He says, "It was in her shirt." She says, "Okay, you said you also located a plastic case. Is that what you said?" He says, "Yes." She says, "What did you believe that to be?" He says, "I don't know. It was just a plastic case." She says, "What did you do with the individual things?" He says, "I believe I picked them up and put them on our bench seat. And as soon as I noticed a police officer, I gave it to them." She says, "You said that you noticed a police officer. Is that correct?" He says, yes. Where was that police officer standing in relation to you? He would have been in the doorway of the side van door of the ambulance. Captain, if I showed you a video recording of yourself in the back of the bus on July 31st performing your medical procedures on Mackenzie Shirilla, would you be able to recognize yourself? He says, yes. Kupak says, I believe this will be State's Exhibit 10. For the record, I'm going to move this video I'm going to play up to 2 minutes or so of this video. I'm going to move this video forward until we get to about 32 minutes. I'm starting at 32 minutes and 28 seconds. So then they play the video. She says, I'm pausing the video at 32 minutes and 35 seconds. Captain, what is depicted on the screen here? He says, that is the back of our ambulance. She says, are you familiar with what the ambulance of the Brea department looks like? He says, yes. She says, I'm pausing it again at 32 minutes and 53 seconds. There was an individual just depicted on the screen here. Who's that individual? He says, that's me. She says, what just happened here, Captain? He said, that was a substance in the baggie that I found. I put it on the floor and alerted the police officer that I found it. She says, what just happened there? He said, that was a black container that I found. She says, for the record, I'm stopping it at 35 minutes and 8 seconds. Captain, is that a fair and accurate depiction of yourself on the EMS assessing Mackenzie Shirilla? He says, yes. She says, is that a fair and accurate depiction finding a substance that you believe to be mushrooms in a black container located on her person? He says, yes. She says, one moment, please, Your Honor. She says, Captain, were you able to document your findings of these mushrooms in any way? He says, yes. She says, can you please explain for us how you documented your discovery of the mushrooms? He says, I added an addendum to my EMS report stating that I found them and turned them over to the Strongsville police officer. She says, okay, if I showed you a copy of that report, would you be able to identify it? He says, yes. She says, may I approach, Your Honor? The court says, yes. Definitely shock. Thank you, Live in Life. 90 is not normal heart rate for a young woman at a resting state. I agree, Mothership. She was in pain. Blood pressure drops in shock. Yeah, that interesting. She says, Captain, I'm handing you State's Exhibit 11. What is State's Exhibit 11? He says, this is a statement for the incident 2217. Hold on. Let me pull up the file. He says, incident report. Okay. She says, is State's Exhibit 11 the same thing depicted on your screen? Sorry. She says, Captain says, yes. She says, what type of report did you categorize this? He says, this is a statement. There is also an addendum on the EMS report as well. She says, Captain, why didn't you include this narrative in your initial report on the patient care report? He says, I'm sorry. She says, why did you not include this narrative about finding the drugs in your initial narrative in the patient care report? He says, that was an error on my part. Wait, what? It wasn't even in his original report? How do you leave that out? Why don't I remember that detail? That was an error on my part. How are you gonna leave out the error, the one of the biggest things? How's that an error? You leave out the drugs. Yeah, I don't buy that. Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. It wasn't in your initial narrative. So you went and added it later. Is that what I'm understanding here? He says that was an error on my part. I was more focused on just accurately providing and documenting patient care. How about you okay, this is literally like Lindsay Clancy. It's like documenting, document, or it didn't happen, right? That's how they're treating the Sykes in Lindsay Clancy case. Okay, well, you're here. You didn't document either. You didn't document appropriately, or you went there after the fact. Yeah, doesn't make you look too good, Captain. That's not an error, says Mothership. That's something that stands out. It's a big deal to me. Yes, it is. Um, that is a big deal. It wasn't in you find rugs and you don't include that in your narrative? Interesting. Interesting. When it's a crime, allegedly, to have drugs. Yeah. He's a fire captain, which, I mean, he's not a police officer, but still, like, you would think he would remember that. It's important. He says, "That was an error on my part." She says, "Okay, if you could, for the record, when was this addendum on your report created?" He says 8/15 of 2022. So he updated it 8/15. So 2 weeks later. Mhm. That's interesting. Because in those 2 weeks, a lot of things happened. A lot of things happened. Like Russo's file an insurance claim. They get Kenzie's phone. I mean, yeah, 2 weeks later, he remembered it. All of a sudden, he remembered that there was rugs involved. Hmm. Exactly, created. Even if he didn't document, he had the body cam, right, or no? So, he went back and fixed it on August 15, 2022. Ms. Kupak says nothing further. The court says cross. This is McDonald now. He says, "My name is Jim McDonald. I'm going to ask you a couple questions. If you don't understand the question, ask me to repeat it or rephrase it." Fair enough. He says, "Yes." McDonald says, "Are you aware that Patrolman Robinson, the prior witness, testified that Miss Shirilla was unresponsive when he arrived there?" Yeah, that's interesting, right? One says she was responsive, one says she wasn't responsive. So who is it and who do we believe? Hmm? No one in my book. Yeah, no, I don't trust anyone on this case, respectfully. Not with Detective Hazoo calling shots to change things like the death certificate. Hmm. Without properly following legal protocol and what is required of him of his job. 2 weeks. Patrolman Robinson says that she was unresponsive, and then Captain says she was responsive. He says, "No." She says, "Was she responsive when you were there?" He says, "To verbal stimuli and painful stimuli." He Kupak says, "Were there things she was not responsive to?" He says, "I think she was. I remember her being a little confused as to events." She says, "Okay." McDonald says, "Okay." Oh, I'm sorry. This is McDonald. McDonald says, "Was there things she was not responsive to?" He says, "I think she was. I remember her being a little confused as to events." McDonald says, "Okay." He says, "But there was nothing I saw that would classify her as unresponsive." McDonald says, "So your perception would just differ from Patrolman Robinson's, right?" He says, "My experience, yes." McDonald says, "Okay, and you testified that neurologically she was okay, correct?" He says, "Yes." McDonald says, "Okay, someone could have a seizure an hour before and you would show up and there would be no signs of it, right?" That's what I said. I said, "What do they know? It took them an hour to get there." Listen, an hour, I'd be freaking out for sure. He says, "Correct." McDonald says, "Okay, so you are not talking about what happened an hour ago. You're just talking about what you observed at least 1 hour after the incident, right?" He says, "My observations were just my contact with her." McDonald says, at that time. So she could have had a seizure before. He says, possibly. Hey, Sil Pardo. Interesting. Troop says, objection. Of course, Troop says, objection. Of course. I expect nothing less of him. I expect nothing less of Shady Troop. Tim Troop. Mm-mm. Wow. The court says, I can't let him guess. McDonald says, if she had a seizure an hour before that, you may not document it and may not show up. The captain says, correct. McDonald says, okay. And when they played Exhibit 10, somebody kept on asking her about Jacob's last name. Do you know who that was asking that question? He says, I don't remember where the voice was coming from. If it was the individual that was a Brea fireman that was with me, that would have been one of the other members in the ambulance with me. McDonald says, the question is, you don't know who was asking that question. Captain says, I don't remember who was asking that question. You just heard it. He says, I heard it, but I don't know who in the back of the ambulance was asking that. McDonald says, you didn't recognize the voice? He says, no, not from that recording, no. McDonald says, and you're not familiar with the first names of the other two people involved in this incident, right? He says, no. McDonald says, and you talked about a blood ox of 82, correct? He says, correct. And that's extremely low, isn't it? He says, yes. McDonald says, have you ever seen or treated anybody with it's pulse ox, right? Not blood ox. That's my bad. I'm sorry. You've never seen that before, have you? He says, on occasion. McDonald says, on occasion? When you see the people who have had a blood ox of 82, what characteristics do you generally observe? He says, generally, for somebody to have a pulse ox that low, 1, they would have just went into cardiac arrest, or 2, just came out of cardiac arrest. This happened to Lindsay Clancy too, huh? I keep going back to it because we're covering it, but she was brought back, right? In the ambulance or something. Cardiac arrest. He says another scenario typically is somebody with COPD or some sort of respiratory ailment where they chronically are low. They're having issues breathing. He says, are there any other areas that you could address are any other causes that you could think of that would cause someone to have a blood ox of 82? Captain says it could have been, as I said earlier, like the probe was not accurately placed on the finger, the nail polish, it could have twisted sideways, or if someone's fingertips are cold. McDonald says, you would have done that test again if that would have happened to get accurate information. He says, yes. McDonald says, did you do it in this particular instance? He says, typically we keep the pulse ox probe on somebody. I don't see another vital sign that showed that it was improvement or decline. She was not displaying typical respiratory difficulties like difficulty speaking. One would only be able to say 1 or 2 words at a time. So my assumption was either cold extremities or the probe was not accurately placed or some sort of internal bleeding going on. McDonald says, we can agree in your report she was confused. He says, yes. McDonald says her eyes were closed. He says, yes. She had fractured bones. Captain says, yes. She was in pain. He says, yes. She told you she didn't know what happened. Captain says, yes. McDonald says, no further questions. The court says, redirect. Ms. Kupak says, just briefly. Just again, Captain, you had described some reason as to why the blood ox would be at 82. Based off your assessment, Mackenzie SHIRILLA was not suffering from COPD, is that correct? He says, correct. Kupak says she was not suffering from cardiac arrest at the time. Is that safe to say? He says, correct. She was speaking and communicating well enough with you. Is that correct? He says, yes. She was answering your questions. He said, yes. And in a timely and somewhat normal manner. He says, slightly delayed, but mostly normal. She says, do you recall if she was cold, if her body felt cold? He says, I don't recall. Miss Kupak says, nothing further. No recross. And that's it for August 8th, 2020. So that was on August 7th, 2023. Recess until August 8th. So that would be the next day. Um, let me pull that up. I might want to read one more section. Actually, maybe we'll end there. Saying she didn't know what happened right away speaks volumes. Getting that messed up and trying to keep wouldn't be easy. I have a question. Oh no. You're gonna ask me if Mackenzie Shirilla is my friend and she's paying me off. Um yeah. Don't know how there's not reasonable doubt and broken ribs. She did have internal bleeding, right? That's what I think we learned later in the reports. Did we not? Um what's your question now in space? Yeah, I think we're gonna end there with that part of the transcript because I don't wanna should we end there or should we go into day 2? Because I could start a new live on day 2 and go through all of day 2. Are you following the Tupac trial? I'm not, but well, not on live at least. Okay, let's see. Let's go. I'm debating. Yeah, we'll end it there. We'll end Kenzie transcripts there. And we'll start on day 2 tomorrow and hopefully get through. There's 4 parts, so let me check. The next day is let's see. Okay, it's detectives. Oh, witnesses are redacted. States, okay, yeah, I have to show you guys this. Look at this. Look at this. How are you gonna have all these state witnesses? And there's more. And look at the defendants. Just 3. That is such shit. Ronald McDonald, you are what we don't want when we're looking for a lawyer. Facts. So in the next day, we hear from Detective Vanek, Adam McQuaid. Okay. Adam is the one I think who had to do with the EDR. Detective Vanek, Dr. Esther Sang, Mark Sergeant Joseph Fellow, and Zaki Hazu. Zaki's at the end. So we will have Mark Sergeant, Adam McQuaid, some redacted names. How do they only call 3 witnesses? Where's Rosie and Bubba? Why didn't they call Rosie and Bubba in since they were with them the night before? Yeah. Let me see. I'm taking a look ahead. Yeah, Stephen Vanek, the detective. Okay, so tomorrow we'll start on that. Detective Vanek. Oh, there's redacted witnesses, and I'm sure we'll know who they are once I get into it. I'll try to find out too. Interesting. Because they wouldn't tell the truth about Dom's life, and we can't have that. Exactly, Crystal. Exactly. I hope you guys tune in when we start re-reviewing the text messages, because I stopped midway through on our second time reading them. And I'm gonna resume on that. Yeah. Hey TS, hey Joe looking. All right, make sure you guys tap that like button. We finished here. Tomorrow we'll start on day 2 of Kenzie Shirilla trial. I need to get caught up on Lindsay Clancy. So right after this, back to back, Lindsay Clancy live. He didn't have much to work with. Who didn't have much to work with? La Puerta, you already know how I feel, okay? You already know how I feel. Mackenzie Shirlett deserves a fair trial. Leave my friend Natalie and Steve alone. Is Mackenzie's lawyer still practicing? I don't know. I hope not. Let's look that up. Actually, I'm curious. I know. Y'all gonna talk shit. It's Jim McDonald. He. Oh, we have a members too coming up. I've been working on that. Oh yeah, he's still prosecute. He serves as a city prosecutor in Brooklyn, Ohio. He went from attorney, so he was being an attorney, now he's prosecutor in Brooklyn, Ohio. But you know what? Jimmy McDonald won't talk to nobody. Jimmy McDonald doesn't want to fess up to his mistakes. Jimmy, we're on to you, Jimmy boy. We know your wife knows Mama Russo. We want to know more. Tell us more, Jimmy. Jimmy Ronald McDonald. Prosecutor? Exactly. Dirty work. Dirty, dirty work. So he got a raise. It says where he serves as city prosecutor for Brooklyn, handles private legal work. But then it says attorney at law. Ah, okay. Interesting. Is that a prosecutor? Wait, is that the real Jimmy McDonald? That's wild. James McDonald, term ending 2028. Public defender commissioners. Yeah, so I guess it is him. Interesting. I'm sure he does know her. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Mama Russo for sure knows. All right, tap that like button. She didn't get a fair trial. No, she didn't. No, she didn't. Mackenzie Shirilla deserves a fair trial. Whether you like her or not. Wouldn't it be interesting to re-review the text messages now after the fact? I still have police reports I haven't reviewed either. So, trying to hold back on the pettiness. Yeah, please drop a like button or what? Please drop a like on the way out. I will schedule the next transcript reading for Mackenzie for tomorrow. Also, we will resume on Hayden's book tomorrow. I know we have part 2 to do. So I'll probably start a little earlier tomorrow, but after this, we have Lindsay Clancy. So tune in for the Lindsay Clancy case right after this live. Um, and thank you for being here. Shout out to the replay viewers. Mackenzie Shirla deserves a fair trial. Bye.